My name is Amelia Grant. I'm 28 years old. For 20 years, my parents called me the slow one, while my sister collected Ivy League degrees and inheritance promises. They mocked my dyslexia at family dinners, excluded me from every important decision, and treated me like the daughter no one expected to succeed. But on my sister's graduation night in New York City, in front of hundreds of guests, a stranger handed me an envelope that exposed every lie my parents had ever told about me. What they didn't know: my grandmother had been watching everything, and what she left behind was powerful enough to turn our entire family empire upside down. My name is Amelia Grant. I'm 28 years old. For most of my life, introductions involving me were short. "This is our younger daughter," my mother would say at charity galas or corporate dinners, her smile polite but already fading as her attention shifted elsewhere. Then her voice would brighten instantly. "And this is Victoria Grant, Columbia Law." That was always the full sentence. Victoria never needed explanation. She belonged in rooms before she even entered them. Professors praised her discipline. Investors remembered her opinions. My parents spoke about her future the way people talked about something inevitable, a certainty already written. I was the space between accomplishments. I was diagnosed with dyslexia when I was 7. Letters refused to stay still. Words rearranged themselves when I tried to read quickly, turning simple paragraphs into exhausting puzzles. Teachers suggested patience. Specialists recommended alternative learning methods. My parents accepted a simpler explanation. Some children simply weren't built for academic success. We lived on the Upper West Side of Manhattan in an apartment overlooking Central Park, the kind of address people recognized immediately. My father, Charles Grant, ran Grant Holdings, a powerful real estate development firm originally founded by my grandmother decades earlier. The company's name appeared on luxury towers, hospital wings, and restoration projects across the city. At dinner, conversations revolved around deals, investments, and reputation. Victoria's internships were analyzed like financial forecasts. Her promotions were expected long before they happened. My presence existed mostly as background, acknowledged politely, rarely discussed. When I was 12, my parents hired private tutors for Victoria, debate coaches, language instructors, admissions consultants who cost more per hour than most families earned in a week. When I asked if I could get extra help learning to read faster, my mother sighed gently. "We've already tried so much, Amelia," she said. "Not everyone needs to excel academically." I believed her because believing hurt less than questioning, so I adapted quietly. Audiobooks replaced textbooks. I drew diagrams instead of writing notes. While classmates memorized paragraphs, I mapped ideas visually. Arrows connecting causes and outcomes, shapes organizing information into systems that finally made sense. No one noticed, except my grandmother. Eleanor Grant lived downtown in an older apartment overlooking the Hudson River. Every Sunday afternoon, I visited her. She never rushed me when I struggled through documents. Instead, she turned contracts into stories and negotiations into puzzles. "You don't read slowly," she told me once, sliding old development agreements across the table. "You read structure." At the time, I didn't understand what she meant. I only knew her apartment was the one place where silence didn't feel heavy. Family holidays were harder. One Christmas, relatives gathered beneath glittering lights, while achievements were announced like awards. My father raised his glass. "Victoria has been accepted into Columbia Law." Applause erupted instantly. Phones appeared. My aunt cried proudly. Then his gaze shifted toward me. "And Amelia," he paused, searching for something neutral, "is still figuring things out." Soft laughter followed. Polite, uncomfortable, unmistakable. I stared at my plate. Across the table, Grandma Eleanor squeezed my hand beneath the cloth. Her grip was firm, steady. When I looked up, her expression wasn't pity. It was anger. 3 months later, she called me to her apartment unexpectedly. Sunlight filled the room as she handed me a small wooden box with brass hinges. "Keep this safe," she said. "What's inside?" "Something for the day people finally show you who they are." I laughed awkwardly, assuming she was being dramatic. Families had favorites sometimes. That didn't mean anything permanent. I placed the box in my closet when I returned home and forgot about it. Years passed. I graduated from a state university, not Ivy League, never Ivy League, and eventually joined Grant Holdings as an administrative assistant. Salary, $46,000 a year. The same month, Victoria joined as junior legal counsel. Her signing bonus alone was rumored to be larger than my yearly income. My job involved scheduling meetings, organizing contracts, and preparing conference rooms for executives who rarely learned my name. I sat close enough to hear decisions worth millions, yet far enough away that no one imagined I understood them. And maybe that was why I started noticing things. Patterns in negotiations, investors who hesitated at certain risks, deals that looked impressive but fragile underneath. During lunch breaks, I filled notebooks with diagrams connecting people and projects, systems forming shapes no spreadsheet revealed. It became a private habit, proof that maybe I wasn't incapable. Late one evening, alone in the office overlooking the Manhattan skyline, a thought settled into my mind for the first time. What if the story my family told about me was never true? And once that question appeared, it refused to disappear. Because sometimes the first crack in a story is all it takes for everything to begin changing. Working at Grant Holdings taught me how invisibility functions. It isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with cruelty or confrontation. Instead, it settles slowly, reinforced through small omissions. Meetings you're not invited to, conversations that pause when you approach, decisions made without ever considering your presence. My desk sat outside the executive corridor, positioned perfectly between importance and irrelevance. Every morning, I prepared briefing folders for leadership meetings I would never attend. I printed contracts worth tens of millions of dollars, aligned presentation decks, and scheduled calls between investors whose names regularly appeared in financial magazines. No one lowered their voices around me. They assumed I wouldn't understand anyway. At first, I believed them. But over time, listening became unavoidable. Patterns emerged naturally, which investors hesitated before signing, which developments were rushed for appearance rather than stability, which executives agreed publicly but disagreed privately in hallways. Reading dense reports still took me longer than others, but when I translated conversations into diagrams, everything clicked instantly. I began carrying a small notebook everywhere. Arrows connected projects, circles grouped partnerships, timelines exposed risks hidden beneath polished language. One afternoon, a junior analyst named Kevin stopped beside my desk while waiting for the elevator. "What's that?" he asked, pointing at my notebook. I closed it halfway. "Just organizing schedules." He caught a glimpse anyway. "That actually explains the Harbor District project better than the financial summary," he said, surprised. Before I could respond, the elevator doors opened and he disappeared inside. The moment passed quickly, but it stayed with me longer than expected. At home, conversations hadn't changed. Dinner still revolved around Victoria's progress. My father described her courtroom observations with admiration usually reserved for successful acquisitions. "She understands strategy," he said one evening. "Leadership instincts can't be taught." My mother nodded approvingly. "Clients trust her immediately." I passed the bread quietly, waiting for the conversation to move on. It never did. 2 weeks later, I noticed Victoria's name appearing repeatedly on executive meeting schedules. Strategy reviews, investment planning, succession discussions. I learned about them because I scheduled the rooms. Late one evening, while organizing archived contracts, I found an old photograph tucked inside a folder. My grandmother stood at a construction site in the 1970s, sleeves rolled up, laughing beside unfinished steel beams. Dirt covered her shoes. She looked nothing like the polished portraits displayed in the lobby downstairs. On the back, written in faded ink, "Built, not inherited." "You found her favorite photo." I turned to see Maria Alvarez, a senior assistant who had worked with my grandmother for decades. "She hated boardrooms," Maria said softly, "preferred construction sites." "She never talked much about the early years," I said. "She didn't need to," Maria replied. Then she added gently, "She talked about you, though." I blinked. "About me?" "All the time," Maria smiled. "Said you noticed what others ignored." Before I could ask more, she returned to her office, leaving me alone with a strange warmth I didn't quite understand. Spring arrived and preparations began for Victoria's graduation celebration, a massive event planned at a luxury hotel in Midtown Manhattan. My mother oversaw every detail personally. Guest lists included investors, judges, and political donors. Floral arrangements were discussed with the seriousness of mergers. It wasn't just a celebration, it was an introduction. Victoria wasn't simply graduating. She was being presented as the future of Grant Holdings. A week before the event, an email appeared in my inbox. Subject: Organizational Restructuring. Confidential. I opened it casually, then reread it 3 times. My position was being eliminated. Effective July 1st. A generous severance package included. For several seconds, the office noise faded entirely. Through the wall behind my desk, my father's voice carried faintly from his office. "We can't keep her here once Victoria steps forward," he said. My mother answered quietly, "People will ask questions." A pause. "She just isn't suited for leadership environments." I sat perfectly still. Not shocked, just certain. The graduation gala was tomorrow night, and suddenly I understood something clearly. I wasn't attending as family. I was attending as someone already being erased. Sometimes people don't push you out loudly. They simply prepare a future where you no longer exist and assume you'll accept it quietly. And if you've ever felt that moment, when you realize you've been written out of your own story, you know how powerful it is when you finally decide to keep reading anyway. The ballroom at the Regency Grand Hotel looked exactly the way my mother liked things to look. Flawless, expensive, and impossible to question. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across white marble floors. A live jazz trio played near the stage, while waiters moved silently between tables, carrying champagne on silver trays. Every detail signaled success. Every detail belonged to Victoria. I paused near the entrance, smoothing the fabric of my black dress. It was simple, the nicest thing I could afford on my salary. But surrounded by designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, it felt painfully ordinary. Guests filled the room quickly. Investors shook my father's hand. Lawyers congratulated my mother. Conversations blended into a steady hum of admiration. No one noticed me standing alone. "Amelia." My mother appeared beside me, her smile fixed but eyes assessing. "You came," she said, as if it were mildly surprising. "Of course." Her gaze moved briefly over my dress, my shoes, my hair. "Well," she said lightly, adjusting her bracelet, "you'll be seated toward the back, table 26. It's better that tonight stays focused." Focused. I nodded even though the word landed heavily. Before walking away, she leaned closer. "This is an important evening for your sister. Try not to draw attention." I watched her disappear into the crowd before heading toward the assigned table, near a column partially blocking the stage view. From there, the celebration felt distant, like watching someone else's life through glass. At 8:30, the lights dimmed. My father stepped onto the stage, confident and composed, applause rising before he even spoke. "Tonight," he began, raising a champagne glass, "we celebrate excellence." The audience quieted instantly. Victoria Grant has graduated near the top of her class at Columbia Law School. She has already secured a position at one of the most respected firms in New York. Cheers filled the room. Victoria joined him on stage, radiant in emerald silk, perfectly comfortable beneath attention. "She represents the future," my father continued proudly, "not only of our family, but of Grant Holdings." More applause. I clapped too, automatically, though my hands felt distant from me. Then came the announcement. "Effective immediately," my father said, pausing for effect. "Victoria will begin transitioning into executive leadership within the company. One day, she will lead what our family has built." The room stood in ovation. Cameras flashed. Guests smiled approvingly. From table 26, I watched my own future quietly disappear. A woman beside me, a distant cousin I barely remembered, leaned over. "So what happens to you now?" she asked gently. I opened my mouth but found no answer, because I already knew. The email, the conversations through office walls, the polite distance. I wasn't part of the future being celebrated tonight. Applause faded slowly. As people returned to their seats, I noticed someone standing near the entrance. An older man in a gray suit, watching the room instead of participating in it. His gaze moved deliberately until it landed on me. A strange unease settled in my chest. He began walking toward my table, step by step, calm and purposeful. When he stopped beside me, the noise of the ballroom seemed to fade again. "Miss Grant?" he asked quietly. "Yes?" "My name is Daniel Reeves," he said, offering a business card. "I was your grandmother's attorney." The words caught me off guard. "My grandmother passed away 3 years ago," I said. "I'm aware," he replied gently. "She left something in my care with very specific instructions." From inside his jacket, he removed a cream envelope sealed with red wax. "I was told to deliver this," he said, "on the day your father publicly chose an heir." My pulse quickened. "What is it?" He held the envelope out. "The document your father doesn't know exists." The weight of it felt heavier than paper should. Around us, laughter resumed. Glasses clinked. Victoria posed for photographs on stage, unaware. Daniel Reeves lowered his voice slightly. "Your grandmother believed you would understand when the time came." I stared down at my name written in familiar handwriting. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, because suddenly the night didn't feel finished. It felt like it had just begun. I didn't remember leaving my chair. One moment, the ballroom was filled with applause, and the next I was walking quickly toward the service corridor, the sealed envelope clutched tightly in my hands. Behind me, laughter swelled again as waiters refreshed drinks and the band resumed playing. Victoria's voice echoed faintly from the stage as she thanked guests. The celebration continued exactly as planned, except now I carried something that didn't belong in their version of the night. The hallway beyond the ballroom was quiet, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that replaced the warm glow of chandeliers. The distant sounds of celebration faded into a dull hum. I stopped beside a stainless steel prep table near the kitchen entrance. My name stared back at me from the envelope, written in my grandmother's handwriting. For a moment, I hesitated. Opening it felt irreversible, like stepping across a line I couldn't step back from. I broke the wax seal. Inside were 3 documents: a folded letter, a notarized legal file, and a smaller envelope labeled in careful script. "Read after." My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the letter. "My dear Amelia, if you are reading this, then your father has finally shown the world what he intended all along. I wish I could have protected you while I was alive. Instead, I prepared something that would protect you when the time came. You were never slow. You simply see structure differently, and people often fear what they do not understand. The enclosed document is my final will executed in September 2019. It replaces all prior versions. Read carefully, then decide who you want to be. With love, Grandmother Eleanor." My throat tightened. I picked up the legal document next. The text was dense. Paragraphs of formal language that once would have overwhelmed me. Letters blurred briefly as old anxiety tried to surface. I forced myself to slow down, one line at a time. The meaning formed gradually. Then a sentence stopped me cold. I reread it, certain I had misunderstood. "To my granddaughter, Amelia Rose Grant, I bequeath 51% of my shares in Grant Holdings, together with all voting rights associated therewith." The hallway seemed to tilt. 51%. Control. My father didn't just plan to pass leadership to Victoria. Legally, he no longer controlled the company. My breathing grew shallow as I continued reading. Another paragraph followed. "This decision is made with full awareness of my son Charles Grant's treatment of Amelia. She has been excluded not due to lack of ability, but lack of opportunity." A sharp ache rose in my chest. She had known. Every dinner, every dismissal, every moment I convinced myself I was imagining things. Near the bottom of the page, bold text caught my attention. "Activation requires the beneficiary to request an emergency board meeting within 72 hours of receiving this document." 72 hours. I checked my phone automatically. 9:02 p.m. The countdown had already begun. My hands shook as I opened the smaller envelope marked "Read After." Inside was a short handwritten note. "You will hesitate," she wrote. "That is why there is a deadline. Courage often needs urgency." I leaned against the cool wall, the documents pressed against my chest. Through the doors behind me, applause erupted again. My father continuing speeches, guests celebrating a future already decided. Except it wasn't. Not anymore. This wasn't revenge. It was a choice. If I acted, everything would change. Headlines, lawsuits, family relationships that might never recover. If I stayed silent, nothing would change. I would lose my job quietly. Victoria would inherit publicly. My father's story would remain untouched. Safe. Predictable. Final. For 28 years, I had waited for permission. To belong, to speak, to be taken seriously. Now permission sat in my hands. I stared at my grandmother's signature one last time. For the first time that night, fear mixed with something new. Not confidence, possibility. Because sometimes the moment that changes your life doesn't feel loud or heroic. Sometimes it feels like standing alone in a quiet hallway, realizing the future everyone planned for you is no longer the only one available. I left the hotel without saying goodbye. No one stopped me. Outside, Manhattan felt colder than it had earlier that evening. Traffic moved steadily along Park Avenue, headlights streaking across wet pavement while strangers hurried past, wrapped in conversations that had nothing to do with inheritance or betrayal. The envelope stayed pressed against my side beneath my coat. For years, leaving family events early meant escape, slipping away before comparisons began or questions turned uncomfortable. Tonight felt different. Tonight I wasn't escaping. I was carrying something unfinished. By the time I reached my apartment, the city had settled into late-night quiet. My roommates were asleep, the living room lit only by orange streetlight filtering through the blinds. I placed the documents carefully on the table and stood there for several minutes, staring at them. 51%. The number still felt unreal. My phone buzzed suddenly. An email notification appeared. Human Resources, Position Transition Confirmation. I opened it slowly. My role at Grant Holdings would officially end in 6 weeks, severance included. Appreciation for my service politely expressed. The timing made everything painfully clear. The gala wasn't just a celebration. It was a replacement. I closed my laptop and walked to my bedroom closet. The wooden box sat exactly where I had left it years earlier, pushed behind winter coats and old storage bins. Dust covered the lid. I hesitated before lifting it down. My grandmother's words echoed in my memory. For the day people finally show you who they are. The brass hinges creaked softly when I opened it. Inside lay 3 items. A handwritten letter, an aged legal document stamped with a date from 1974, and a small flash drive clearly added much later. I unfolded the letter first. Amelia, if you are opening this, then the moment has arrived sooner than I hoped. Grant Holdings was built through risk, not entitlement. Leadership belongs to those who protect what others depend on, not those who inherit comfort. The enclosed agreement is the original founding partnership. It guarantees that controlling shares cannot be diluted without board approval. The drive contains records you may one day need. Use them wisely, not for revenge, but for fairness. Love always, Grandmother Eleanor. My pulse quickened. I plugged the flash drive into my laptop. Several folders appeared instantly. Meeting minutes, archived emails, legal transcripts. One file stood out immediately. Board meeting recording, March 2018. I pressed play. My father's voice filled the room. She's no longer capable of understanding modern business, he said. Reducing her voting rights is necessary for stability. Other voices objected. Questions followed. The motion failed narrowly. I froze. He hadn't simply favored Victoria. He had tried to remove his own mother's control while she was still alive. The realization settled heavily. This wasn't misunderstanding. It was strategy. I leaned back slowly, staring at the ceiling. All those years of quiet tension suddenly made sense. The guarded conversations, my grandmother's watchfulness, the box she insisted I keep safe. She hadn't left me power impulsively. She had prepared for this. I checked the time. 11:58 p.m. The 72-hour deadline continued moving forward. If I did nothing, everything would proceed exactly as planned. My father's leadership would remain unquestioned. Victoria's transition would continue smoothly. My disappearance would look natural, simple, clean, forgotten. I picked up Daniel Reeves's business card from the table. My thumb hovered over my phone screen. Doubt whispered familiar arguments. Don't create conflict. Don't embarrass yourself. Don't step into rooms meant for stronger people. For most of my life, that voice had won. Tonight, another thought answered it quietly. What if silence had never protected me, only delayed this moment? I opened a new message. Mr. Reeves, I would like to proceed. Please advise how to request the emergency board meeting. I stared at the words before pressing send. Nothing dramatic happened afterward. No surge of confidence, just stillness. But inside that stillness, something shifted. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to my family's decisions. I was making one of my own. And once you cross that line, once you decide your story belongs to you, the future stops feeling predetermined. It starts feeling possible. Daniel Reeves called at 7:12 the next morning. I answered before the second ring, already awake, already sitting at my kitchen table surrounded by documents I had reread half the night. The petition is ready, he said calmly. To call an emergency board meeting, 3 directors must sign. 1 already has. 2 more agreed this morning. My grip tightened around the phone. They agreed without talking to me? They trusted your grandmother, he replied. In companies built over generations, reputation travels farther than introductions. An hour later, I walked into Grant Holdings as if nothing had changed. The lobby looked identical. Polished marble floors, glass walls reflecting the skyline, framed photographs of completed developments stretching through decades of success. Employees greeted each other normally, coffee machines hissed, elevators chimed. Everything appeared stable, but beneath that calm, something irreversible had already begun. At my desk, emails waited exactly as usual. Calendar updates, vendor confirmations, meeting adjustments for executives who still saw me as part of the background. At 10:41 a.m., my phone vibrated. Emergency board meeting request. Filed. The words felt heavier than expected. Across the office, no one reacted. Conversations continued. Phones rang. Someone laughed near reception. No one knew ownership had already shifted. You look pale. I glanced up to see Maria Alvarez watching me carefully from beside my desk. Didn't sleep much, I admitted. She studied me for a moment longer than usual. Your grandmother used to look like that before difficult decisions. Before I could ask what she meant, she returned to her office. By early afternoon, the atmosphere changed. Executives moved faster through hallways. Doors closed mid-conversation. Assistants exchanged quiet looks. Information traveled invisibly through companies like this. Never announced, always sensed. At 1:58 p.m., my phone rang. Amelia. Victoria's voice sounded tight, controlled. What did you do? I'm not sure what you mean. Dad just received notice of an emergency board meeting, she said, requested by Margaret Langley and 2 other directors. So the news had reached them. I didn't realize board members needed approval to meet, I replied carefully. A pause stretched across the line. Don't pretend this isn't connected to you, she said. Margaret hasn't initiated anything in years. Maybe she finally has concerns, I said quietly. Her composure cracked. If you're trying to embarrass this family, I'm doing my job. She hung up without another word. 20 minutes later, my father stormed past my desk toward his office. He didn't acknowledge me, but tension followed him like a storm front. His door slammed hard enough to shake nearby frames. Through the wall, his voice carried clearly. This is unnecessary, he snapped into the phone. We'll address it and move on. Margaret's overreacting. A pause. No, Amelia isn't involved. She wouldn't even understand what this is about. I stared at my monitor, strangely calm. For years, those assumptions hurt. Today, they protected me. Late afternoon brought confirmation. Emergency board meeting. Saturday, 10 a.m., executive floor. 2 days away. Reality settled slowly. I wasn't questioning my place anymore. I was walking directly into the system that had decided my worth long before I had a voice. That evening, my apartment table filled with papers. Copies of the will, founding agreements, transcripts, diagrams connecting decisions across years. The same visual patterns that helped me survive school now revealed strategies hidden beneath polished corporate language. Doubt crept in quietly. What if they dismissed me again? What if I froze when everyone looked at me? I almost closed the folder. Instead, I remembered something simple. Every person who ever told me I wasn't capable spoke with certainty. But certainty isn't proof. Sometimes the hardest moment isn't confronting others. It's deciding you deserve to be heard at all. I packed everything carefully into my bag. Saturday morning would not just determine ownership. It would decide whether I continued living inside the version of myself others created or stepped into one I finally chose. And if you've ever reached that point, when staying silent feels heavier than speaking, you already know something important. Change rarely begins with confidence. It begins with the quiet decision to keep going anyway. Saturday morning felt unreal. Manhattan, mornings usually carried noise and urgency. But as I stepped out of the taxi in front of Grant Holdings Tower, the city seemed strangely quiet. Sunlight reflected off the glass facade, turning the building into a mirror that showed me someone I barely recognized. Same gray blazer, same nervous hands. But this time, I wasn't entering through the employee entrance. I walked through the front doors. The weekend lobby felt ceremonial, empty enough that every step echoed across the marble floor. Security glanced up as I approached. "Name?" the guard asked. "Amelia Grant." He checked his tablet, paused briefly, then nodded toward the executive elevators. My pulse quickened as the doors closed behind me, 42 floors upward. Each passing number felt like a countdown. I had spent 2 years scheduling meetings on this level without ever stepping onto it myself. The executive floor was reserved for leadership. Decisions made here shaped projects worth hundreds of millions. Today I walked in alone. The hallway stretched wide and silent, framed by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. Staff members paused mid-conversation as I passed. Recognition flickered, followed quickly by confusion. I stopped outside the boardroom doors where a security attendant stood waiting. "Name?" he asked. "Amelia Grant." He checked the list and frowned. "You're not authorized for this meeting." Before I could respond, heels clicked sharply behind me. "Of course she isn't." Victoria approached, composed as always, dressed in a navy suit that made her look every inch the future executive everyone expected. Her smile appeared polite for the guard's benefit. "This is a restricted session," she said quietly to me. I was invited to present information. Her expression tightened slightly. "Amelia, this isn't appropriate. You work in administration." "The nature of my presentation is confidential." For a moment, uncertainty crossed her face. Then my father appeared at the far end of the hallway, walking quickly with 2 senior executives. The moment he saw me, disbelief hardened into irritation. "What is she doing here?" he asked. Victoria answered smoothly. "I was explaining she can't attend." My father stopped a few feet away, folding his hands behind his back, the posture he used when correcting employees. "Amelia," he said calmly, "go home. This doesn't concern you." Before I could respond, the boardroom door opened. "Actually," a firm voice interrupted, "it does." Margaret Langley stepped into the hallway. Even in her 70s, she carried authority effortlessly. Silver hair framed a face untouched by hesitation. "I invited her," Margaret said. "She has standing to address the board." My father's jaw tightened. "That's highly irregular." "So is ignoring governance," Margaret replied evenly. "Let her in." A long silence followed. Finally, my father stepped aside. "Fine," he said coldly. "We'll resolve this quickly." The boardroom felt smaller than I imagined. An oval walnut table surrounded by leather chairs, portraits of past executives lining the walls. My grandmother's portrait hung above the fireplace, her painted gaze steady and watchful. Daniel Reeves sat near the corner with his briefcase, offering me a small nod. Board members settled into their seats, murmuring quietly. Some looked curious. Others avoided eye contact entirely. I was directed to a chair at the far end of the table. The distance felt intentional. Robert Langford, chairman of the board, called the meeting to order. "This emergency session was requested by directors Langley, Chen, and Alvarez," he said. "Margaret, you have the floor." Margaret stood briefly. "The matter concerns documentation affecting company ownership." She turned toward me. "I yield my time to Ms. Grant." Every gaze shifted. My father leaned back, expression calm but dismissive. I stood slowly, forcing my hands to remain steady. "Thank you," I began. "What I'm about to present may come as a surprise. I ask only that the board review the evidence before reaching conclusions." Before I could continue, my father raised a hand. "Mr. Chairman," he said smoothly, "context is necessary." Robert hesitated, then nodded. "Amelia is my daughter," my father continued warmly. "She works in an administrative role and has no legal or financial training." Victoria added gently, she also struggles with dyslexia. Complex documents can be difficult for her. Several board members shifted uncomfortably. The words landed exactly as intended. Polite, reasonable, quietly diminishing. For a second, old instincts returned. Sit down, apologize, leave. Then I looked at my grandmother's portrait watching from the wall. Something inside me settled. I opened my folder. I won't be discussing my reading ability today, I said calmly. I'll be discussing this. I lifted the document into view. The room fell completely silent. The paper felt heavier than it should have. For a moment, no one spoke. The quiet inside the boardroom pressed against my ears, broken only by the faint hum of the city far below. This, I said, placing the document carefully on the polished table, is the final will and testament of Eleanor Grant, founder of Grant Holdings. My father leaned forward immediately. That's impossible, he said sharply. My mother's estate was settled years ago. You received a copy of her earlier will, I replied evenly. This version was executed later. I slid the document toward Robert Langford. The chairman adjusted his glasses, examining the notarized seal. Across the table, Victoria's confident expression faltered for the first time. There must be some misunderstanding, she said. Legal documents don't appear out of nowhere. They do, Daniel Reeves said calmly as he stood, when they are held under legal instruction. All attention turned toward him. I served as Eleanor Grant's personal attorney, he continued. I witnessed the execution of this will in September 2019. Its authenticity is fully verifiable. A murmur moved around the table. My father's expression hardened. My mother was elderly, he said. She could have been influenced. I opened my folder again. Before discussing intent, I said quietly, I would like a passage read into the record. Robert hesitated, then nodded. Proceed. I inhaled slowly, forcing my voice to remain steady. To my granddaughter, Amelia Rose Grant, I bequeath 51% of my shares in Grant Holdings, together with all associated voting rights. The sentence landed like a physical impact. Someone inhaled sharply. Victoria shook her head. That's not possible. Jonathan, no, Daniel, spoke again, measured and precise. Under state law, a valid subsequent will supersedes all prior testamentary documents. Robert looked up slowly. 51% constitutes controlling interest. Silence followed. For the first time since entering the room, my father looked directly at me. Not past me, not through me, at me. This changes nothing, he said quietly. Even if authentic, Amelia has no executive experience. She cannot run a company of this scale. I'm not asking to run daily operations, I answered. Confusion crossed several faces. Then what are you asking? Victoria demanded. I removed another document from my folder, printed transcripts taken from the files my grandmother left behind. I'm asking the board to consider context. I pressed play on my phone. My father's recorded voice filled the room. She no longer understands modern business. Reducing her voting rights is necessary. The recording ended. The silence afterward felt heavier than before. Robert's gaze moved slowly toward my father. Charles, is this accurate? That was a private discussion, he snapped. Taken out of context. It demonstrates, I said calmly, that my grandmother anticipated attempts to remove her authority. This will was written afterward. Margaret Langley nodded once. I remember that meeting, she said quietly. She was deeply upset. Victoria stood abruptly. Even if the will is valid, Amelia lacks qualifications. Ownership doesn't equal leadership. For years, those words would have undone me. Now they sounded distant. I'm not here to take something I didn't build, I said. I'm here because ownership has already changed. Robert exchanged looks with several board members. We will require legal verification, he said finally. It is already underway, Daniel replied. Copies were submitted this morning. My father stood suddenly, palms pressed flat against the table. This meeting is adjourned until verification is complete. No, Robert said firmly. We recess. Board members rose, conversations breaking into tense whispers. Attorneys stepped into the hallway, phones already dialing. I remained seated. Across the room, Victoria argued quietly with my father, frustration replacing composure. His gestures were sharp, controlled anger barely contained. For the first time in my life, he looked uncertain. Margaret approached and rested a hand lightly on my shoulder. "She prepared you for this," she said softly. I nodded, unable to speak. Through the windows, Manhattan stretched endlessly below. The same city where I had felt invisible only days earlier. Now 12 powerful people waited for confirmation of something already true. Nearly 40 minutes later, legal counsel returned and whispered to Robert. The chairman straightened slowly. "Please take your seats." Everyone settled again. "Our legal review confirms the will is valid under state law," Robert announced. A pause followed. "As of this moment, Amelia Grant is the majority shareholder of Grant Holdings." The balance of power shifted without a sound. The words majority shareholder lingered in the air long after Robert Langford finished speaking. No one moved. Power didn't arrive with applause. It arrived with hesitation. The careful silence people used when they realized the rules of a room had just changed. My father remained standing, hands gripping the back of his chair. "This will be contested," he said finally, voice tight but controlled. "Immediately." Daniel Reeves answered calmly. "You are free to pursue review, Mr. Grant. However, the document satisfies all legal requirements. A successful challenge would be unlikely." Victoria looked between us, disbelief replacing confidence. "This doesn't make sense," she said. "Even if Amelia owns shares, she has no operational experience. She can't lead this company." The statement sounded painfully familiar. For years, those words defined my limits. Now they felt strangely distant. Robert cleared his throat. "As majority shareholder, Ms. Grant has authority to introduce motions before the board." Every gaze turned toward me. My heartbeat slowed instead of racing. This was the moment everyone expected. The dramatic dismissal, the revenge they assumed I had come to claim. With one sentence, I could remove my father immediately. For a brief second, I imagined it. Watching certainty disappear from his face the way confidence had once disappeared from mine. But the image felt empty. I remembered my grandmother's letter. Not revenge, fairness. I stood. "I have one motion," I said. My father gave a short, humorless laugh. "Of course you do." I ignored him and addressed the table. "I am not proposing to remove Charles Grant as CEO." Confusion rippled through the room. Victoria blinked, clearly unprepared. "What I am proposing," I continued, "is a formal vote of confidence." Robert leaned forward slightly. "Clarify." "The board will determine whether current leadership retains its confidence," I said. "If the majority votes yes, operations continue unchanged. If not, transition procedures begin according to company bylaws." Victoria stood abruptly. "This is absurd. You're turning governance into a spectacle." "No," I replied evenly. "I'm following the governance framework my grandmother established." Margaret Langley spoke immediately. "Seconded." The word carried weight. Robert nodded. "Very well, we proceed to vote." My father's eyes locked onto mine. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. "Maybe." But for the first time, the decision wasn't about earning his approval. "All those expressing confidence in Charles Grant as CEO," Robert said. "Raise your hands." 4 hands lifted slowly, longtime allies who owed their positions to him. Robert counted carefully. "All those expressing no confidence." 1 hand rose, then another, Margaret's, then more. 7 in total. The outcome became undeniable before the count finished. Robert exhaled softly. "The motion carries. 7 votes of no confidence, 4 in favor, 1 abstention." The room fell completely still. "Per company bylaws," he continued, "Mr. Grant has 30 days to tender his resignation." My father didn't argue. He didn't shout. He simply looked at me, truly looked, as if seeing someone unfamiliar for the first time. For years, I imagined this moment filled with anger. Instead, what passed between us was recognition. He had underestimated me completely, and it had cost him everything. Without another word, he gathered his papers and walked toward the door. Victoria hesitated before following, her certainty replaced by confusion. The door closed softly behind them. No drama, just finality. Margaret placed a gentle hand over mine. "Your grandmother would be proud," she said. I wasn't sure how to respond. Victory didn't feel triumphant. It felt quiet. Because power hadn't given me something new, It had taken away the last illusion that my family might someday become what I once hoped for. Robert spoke gently. "Ms. Grant, the board will discuss interim leadership and your future role." I nodded faintly, barely hearing him. Outside the windows, Manhattan moved normally. Taxis flowing through streets, people living ordinary lives untouched by boardroom decisions. For 28 years, I had tried to prove I belonged. Now the fight was over. And strangely, the strongest feeling left behind was relief. The elevator doors closed softly behind me, carrying me down from the executive floor. For the first time since the meeting began, everything was quiet. No arguments, no applause, no expectations. Just the low hum of movement as the numbers descended one by one. My reflection stared back at me in the mirrored walls. Same gray blazer, same tired eyes. Yet something fundamental had shifted. For years, I walked into Grant Holdings trying not to take up space. Now I was leaving as the person who owned most of it. And strangely, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like release. Outside the building, Manhattan moved exactly as it always had. Taxis rushing past, people crossing streets without hesitation, conversations blending into the rhythm of a city that never paused for personal revolutions. The world hadn't changed, only my place inside it had. Daniel Reeves waited near the entrance. "Well," he said gently, "your grandmother always believed you would choose fairness." "I didn't feel brave," I admitted. He smiled slightly. "Important decisions rarely feel brave while they're happening." We spoke briefly about next steps, legal transitions, interim leadership, meetings I would soon attend not as support staff, but as decision maker. The words still felt unfamiliar. When I finally returned home, exhaustion settled into my bones. I sat on the couch in silence, listening to distant traffic outside my window. For years, I imagined what recognition would feel like. I never imagined it would come with grief. Because winning meant accepting something painful. My parents had never misunderstood me. They had simply chosen not to see me. The official announcement arrived the next afternoon. Charles Grant, resignation effective June 15th. Robert Langford appointed interim CEO. Amelia Grant named strategic advisor to the board. I read the message slowly, then closed my laptop. Within minutes, messages began arriving. Colleagues who once passed my desk without greeting suddenly wanted meetings. Investors requested introductions. People who barely knew my name now spoke carefully, respectfully. I answered only a few. One message stopped me, from Maria Alvarez. "Your grandmother always said you saw patterns others ignored. She would be proud today." I saved it. Some validation arrives quietly, and somehow means more because of it. The personal conversations came later. My mother called first. Her voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. "Amelia, could we talk?" We met at a small cafe near Central Park. She looked older somehow, certainty replaced by something fragile. "I'm sorry," she said simply. No excuses, no explanations, just truth. I didn't forgive her immediately. Healing doesn't work like that. But for the first time, we spoke honestly. Not as roles inside a perfect family image, but as two people trying to understand where things had broken. Months later, Victoria reached out too. Therapy, she admitted during a walk through the park, had forced her to confront expectations she never questioned. "I thought being perfect protected me," she said quietly. "I didn't realize it meant leaving you alone." We didn't become close overnight. Instead, we started slowly. Conversations without comparison, honesty without competition. By autumn, I moved into a small apartment overlooking the Hudson River, not far from where my grandmother once worked during the company's earliest years. My new role focused on sustainable housing initiatives, long-term projects instead of prestige developments. It felt closer to her vision than anything Grant Holdings had pursued in years. Some evenings, sunlight touched her portrait hanging on my wall, and I finally understood what she had really left me. Not control, not wealth, permission. Permission to stop measuring my worth through other people's expectations. Dyslexia had never been my flaw. It had taught me patience, pattern recognition, and the ability to see systems others overlooked. Looking back, the real turning point wasn't the board vote or the inheritance. It was the moment I stopped waiting for approval from people unwilling to give it. If there's one thing I learned, it's this. Being overlooked can feel like the end of your story, until you realize it's only the chapter before you begin writing it yourself. And sometimes, someone listens to a story like this and recognizes a piece of their own life inside it. When that happens, the story doesn't really end. It continues quietly, in choices made afterward. Because the greatest inheritance isn't power. It's finally knowing your value never needed permission to exist.